Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to those on the West and Central time zones. We also want to wish a good evening to those following us in Europe, in Israel, and parts abroad. Today we're blessed. I apologize. Today we're blessed that we have Jonathan Schanzer, and Jonathan is going to be giving an incredible strategic analysis of the situation. We specifically pre-recorded this because of so many variables and so many factors that are taking place. This has been pre-recorded a couple of days in advance, and we want to ask Jonathan what the deal looks like, what a cessation of the ceasefire looks like, and what the ramifications are, both in terms of Gaza, but also potentially a multi-front war. Without further ado, the senior analyst for FDD, for the Foundations of the Defense of Democracy, our good friend and a friend of the FIDF, Jonathan Schanzer.
Hi, Steve. Thank you, and pleasure to be with everybody today. Look, what we're watching right now is a very fluid situation. Obviously, I think it's a positive sign that Donald Trump has said that he wants all the hostages out now, and Bibi is, of course, very pleased to see this. This is the direct result of conversations that took place between Netanyahu and Trump at the White House. But I think a couple of things to point out here. Number one is, I think the Israelis, at least as I understood it from speaking to some senior people in Israel just about, well, actually, it was when the deal was first announced. I was able to talk to two of the authors of the deal, of this three-phase deal for the hostage for prisoner swap that we've been watching. The Israelis, at least who authored it, did not want to go to phase two. In other words, phase one was releasing the women, children, elderly, sick, and injured, those who were uninvolved in military conflict. The second phase was going to be the release of IDF soldiers, and the third would be largely bodies, if not entirely bodies. But by entering into phase two, Israel would have agreed to an end of war, an end of conflict. They did not want to do that. For those that want to see the IDF dismantle Hamas, phase two was just simply untenable. So we've arrived at a place that I think was largely predictable when you consider what the Israeli goals were. The negotiators in Doha did not get a green light from Bibi to continue to negotiate for the implementation of phase two. And that's ultimately what we're now seeing unfold, that Hamas is refusing to release additional hostages. What we did not expect was for Donald Trump to come out the way that he did and say that all bets are off and that he's giving Israel a full green light to go into Gaza, to dismantle Hamas, and to potentially end the threat from Hamas once and for all. But I think there's, additional levels of analysis here that we should look at. One is that if this war begins again, yes, Israel has the green light to dismantle Hamas, and I think that's obviously a very positive thing. But at the same time, we have seen statements coming from the Houthis, for example, in Yemen. This is the most active of the proxies of Iran that we've watched over the last several months. These are the ones that have been sending ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel. They will do that again. They're unafraid of the ramifications of doing that, even as the U.S., even as Israel in the past, has hammered them when they have sent these rockets and missiles toward Israel. The big question right now is whether Donald Trump warns the Houthis, responds to the Houthis. Unclear where we are. This would be the first confrontation between Donald Trump and this Iran-backed terrorist organization. But it's not just the Houthis that would be potentially threatening to Israel. We have a potential hot front in Lebanon. Remember, the Lebanese Hezbollah has been largely picked apart by the IDF, but not fully. That means that there are still military leaders and commanders that are able to fight Israel, should they choose to. Now, should they choose to is a big caveat. We know that they're already weak and may not want to sustain more damage, but also let's remember, that arsenal of missiles and drones and rockets that Hezbollah had at the beginning of this war, at one point it was estimated to be about 150 to 180,000 projectiles. Israel is, according to the reports that I've heard from folks on the ground in Israel, they've destroyed 2/3 of that arsenal. But what that means, and that's obviously terrific news, but what that means is that Hezbollah still has 50 to 60,000 weapons that it can deploy against Israel should it choose to. Iran still has proxies that are operating in the West Bank. We've seen an immense amount of military activity in the West Bank, even during this ceasefire. I am concerned that Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other groups could be mobilized there to engage in more coordinated violence against Israel. We have Iraq, which still has dozens of Shiite militias that are armed with missiles and drones that could attack Israel as well. And then there's this wild card that we have in Syria. There's a new government there, as we all know. It is run by a group that we collectively call HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but that is formerly known as the Nusra Front. It's an al-Qaeda group. It has vowed that it wants to stay out of this war, but this is the first time since Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, the leader of HTS, this will be the first time that he would come face to face with the specter of joining this war against Israel. So he's a wild card. Finally, the other wild card from a military perspective is Iran itself. We know that Israel, back in October, in a spectacular display of military might, took out Iran's strategic air defenses, almost all of them, if not all of them, as well as Iran's ballistic missile production capabilities. They still have something like 2,000 or more ballistic missiles at their disposal. They could fire those at Israel if they wanted to. So the question is, while Israel has a plan to destroy Hamas, and undoubtedly the IDF has that, the question is, what is Iran's plan? And what does this mean moving forward? Now, last thing, Steve, I'll just note, we've all been talking a lot about Trump's comments as it relates to the day after in Gaza. I would argue that it is positive what he's already said, namely that the people of Gaza should be allowed to leave the Gaza Strip if they wish, to allow for the Gaza Strip to be rebuilt. I'm not sure I love the idea of the United States taking on the full burden of this. I certainly don't want to see American service members deployed to Gaza. I'd rather not even see American contractors. I'd like to see the Arab world taking responsibility for what has happened, because they have facilitated, they have pampered, if you will, Hamas over the years. They have not demanded its dismantlement. They have not pushed Hamas out of the picture politically. They have embraced it. And so I think the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, they all bear some responsibility here. And I think it's good that Donald Trump is pushing them to take some responsibility. I think the other thing that's very positive here is that Donald Trump is shattering some longstanding sclerotic, ossified Arab nationalist thinking dating back to the War of Independence of 1948 and 1949. Right? It was back then that all of the Arab states in unison said that Palestinians would not be relocated. They would not be removed from the territory that they had deemed part of their the Palestinian National Project. What Donald Trump is now saying is, look, this is unsustainable in the Gaza Strip. We have to address this. We have to allow for people to leave. This is not a sword that you want to fall on. You have other interests. And he's beginning to force the Arab world to at least begin to think outside of the box and to show some flexibility. I'm not saying that at the end of the day, Donald Trump is going to dismantle Palestinian nationalism or forcibly remove Palestinians from territory that they want to live in. But I think what he is doing is telling the Arab world and the Palestinians that if people want to live a different life, where they are not forced to being living symbols of the Palestinian cause, there is now a window for doing so because the President of the United States has forced the issue. So I think that's positive. Now, on the other positive side of this, I will just note that the Saudis loom large. The Saudis are part of the coalition of Arab states that have been pushing back against Donald Trump's call for the evacuation of Gazans from the Gaza Strip. The fact that the Saudis have opposed this, some people have said, well, that's going to set back normalization. I would argue here that this is the opening gambit in a dialogue that was inevitable between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis want certain things from the United States. They want the right to enrich uranium on their soil. They want a defense pact with the United States. They want air defenses. They want offensive capabilities They may want the F-35. They want to sell oil to the rest of the world, and they want America to make sure that their country is safe from surrounding threats. That's a long list. So the US is saying, Saudi Arabia, you need to step up as it relates to Gaza. And thus the conversation is beginning for a possible normalization deal between Israel and some kind of pact between the United States. So I don't see any of Saudi Arabia's pushback right now as negative. I see it as the beginning of a conversation that was arrested when Donald Trump lost the election back in 2020. Joe Biden set back the cause of normalization by years, but now we get an opportunity to watch up close as Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Donald Trump resume what they had started back from Donald Trump's first term. So there are significant risks and there are significant opportunities as we look now at the first several weeks of the Donald Trump administration, Trump 2.0, and his renewed relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Jonathan, thank you. A couple of questions. The 50,000 rockets potentially that exist in the hands of Hezbollah throughout Lebanon, what do we know about the power of them? Before the war, they had that the CIA could confirm over 2,000 precision-guided missiles. They have long-term, they have mid-range, and they have short-term rockets. What in their arsenal still exists? Is it primarily short-range rockets, or is some of those very powerful long-term rockets as well?
It's both. The Israelis obviously have done a lot of good work in southern Lebanon. The IDF is deployed there. It's still deployed there. And it continues to find weapons and to destroy them. So the short-range rockets are not fully depleted, but I think a lot of them have been found. They've been destroyed. They've been sent elsewhere. I've heard, by the way, that at least there was an idea of sending some of them to Ukraine, for example, to allow them to be used in the war against Russia, which I would fully embrace. I think this is a potentially positive way for Israel to contribute to that effort without having to put additional skin in the game. It's the stuff that exists above the Litani River that concerns me, right? These are medium range and longer range rockets. The further north you get, the harder it would be for Israel to find every last rocket, whether they be precision guided munitions. I've heard that right now there's maybe 1,000 to 1,500 of them remaining. Could be less. We know the Israelis have done a lot of precision strikes throughout Lebanon to try to erode this capability, but it's not gone. And so what we have right now is still a threat. Now, the question really becomes will on the part of Hezbollah. Are they willing to challenge Israel in this way, knowing that they will incur significant additional damage? That's on top of the beeper operations and pagers and the targeted killings of its top leaders and the destruction of those arsenals. They're in bad shape, Hezbollah is. But I will say that there are some dangerous things that are happening right now that could expedite a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. One of them is the end of the ceasefire, which, again, I think it's imminent. We're expecting it on Saturday. We'll see if anything happens to change the trajectory of that, but that's one thing that we're watching. But the other is the call from Morgan Ortagus. This is the deputy envoy to the Middle East working for Stephen Witkoff. She has announced that Israel must withdraw from southern Lebanon on February 18th. That's next week, Steve. And the Lebanese armed forces have not gotten a handle on the territory that was once fully controlled by Hezbollah south of the Litani River. If the LAF is put in charge, they will fail. I mean, this is Lucy and the football, right? We have been talking about the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 for decades now, right? I mean, for years we've been talking about how the Lebanese armed forces need to deploy, that UNIFIL needs to, watch Hezbollah and prevent the redeployment of Hezbollah throughout the region, throughout the southern region of Lebanon. This is not going to happen right now. The Lebanese armed forces are not ready. The new government of Lebanon, such as it is, right? These are not people that are prepared. They don't have the political will, nor do they have the capability of getting into a tussle with Hezbollah. I would also further argue that the new government that's just been installed in Lebanon, everyone's talking about how it's more pragmatic and that it really wants to turn the table on Hezbollah and change the status quo in Lebanon. Let me just make it very clear. The president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, is the former head of the LAF, which did nothing for years, sitting on its hands, watching Hezbollah take over the country militarily. The LAF is complicit in the crisis that we're now seeing in Lebanon. The new prime minister, Nawaf Salam, this is the man who is the president of the International Court of Justice, and he was presiding over this body when it began to prosecute Israel for the crime of defending itself. I don't expect him to lift a finger against Hezbollah in any significant way. And then there are going to be at least 4, maybe 5 members of the Amal party that will be part of this government. The Amal party these are political allies of Hezbollah. This is not a government that we can trust. I think we could still try to enact reform. We could still try to push this government to do better. But I would not expect this government in Lebanon to prevent Hezbollah from taking back over those positions that were vacated south of the Litani that right now the Israelis continue to control. I want to see the IDF stay there. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how this discussion unfolds between now and the 18th of February.
In terms of Iran getting involved, if Iran gets involved, they set themselves up for a strike from Israel, for a response from Israel, that obviously will have the ability to do very significant damage to their strategic assets, whether it's the uranium enrichment, whether it's the storehouses of these ballistic missiles that they have, etc. So it's a strong possibility that Iran themselves do not get involved. They use their proxies instead. Is there any chance that in this equation, Iran using its proxies is the equivalent to Israel, is the equivalent to the United States, as Iran getting directly involved? Meaning that you cut off the head of the octopus. Have you heard any conversation along those lines?
Look, you're asking the million-dollar question, Steve. And I think the Israelis, we know where they are. I think they see the opportunity. They don't have all of the systems that they need to do all of the damage that they'd like to do to the Iranian nuclear program. For example, some of these facilities that are embedded deep underground inside a mountain, et cetera, those are things that are going to need the U.S. And they would love nothing more than the U.S. to do some of that work while they do perhaps the rest. But I think there is a big question right now that looms. If you look closely at the rhetoric of the president, what he's basically said is that maximum pressure against the regime is already underway, right? We're putting those sanctions back on. And Israel has a green light to target Hamas. And by the way, to probably target all of the other proxies that Iran has deployed against Israel. The question of striking Iran itself seems like something that the president is not keen on right now. He has mentioned on a handful of occasions already this notion that he may want to try to get a deal done with Iran. This is extremely dangerous, in my view. Number one, it gives a lifeline to the regime, and it begins to understand that as long as it negotiates, it's safe. And this is essentially what their strategy was during the Obama years, and to some extent even during the Biden years, even though a deal was never reconsummated. So what I would just say, though, right now is that the Israelis need to be very careful about this delicate situation. They cannot anger the president of the United States. They need to work with the U.S. as it relates to Iran. They need to be patient and, I think, try to bring the president around to their position. But right now, the president's position does not seem to be, anyway, geared toward a strike on Iran. Maybe he gives the Israelis a green light to do it on their own. Maybe. But right now, he does seem like he wants to put pressure on the regime to get them to yes. And as we know, that is a dangerous road that we've been down before.
The second question regarding Hezbollah and the question regarding the Houthis. In the event that Hezbollah joins in together with together with Hamas and other Iranian proxies. There's a hotbed of Hezbollah in the Bekaa Valley. There's a hotbed of Hezbollah in the southern neighborhoods of Beirut. All of those would be open game. All those would be fair game in terms of if there was a strike. And there was not significant battles. There were airstrikes in those areas, but there were not significant battles during the war in October and November. That's question number one. Number two is, if the Houthis start firing rockets, and it's clear that it's not like there's any one concentrated area that's a hotbed, they use disparate locations, etc. Could you see possibly American and other troops being involved in responding to the Houthis in the event that they started striking Israel?
So two fascinating questions to ponder. Look, on Lebanon, I'll just say this. There are a lot of targets that weren't struck. The Israelis were very careful in the war that they fought, trying not to escalate until they did. What I would note currently is that the weapons that were being held up by the Biden administration are no longer held up. That means that the MK-84s, these 2,000-pound bombs, very powerful weapons, could be used against Hezbollah in these disparate locations that you've mentioned. And so I think that there is the potential to do great harm to Hezbollah if they decide to get into the act here. I think it's an open question whether they'll do it, because I think right now they're very much licking their wounds. They're trying to figure out how to reconstitute as Israel, really eviscerated the top echelons of their leadership, took out a lot of their capabilities. And by the way, if you listen to former Defense Minister Gallant, who's recently come out and talked about what Israel's plans had been for October 11th, right, a mere 4 days after the attack launched by Hamas, there was a plan to do even graver damage to Hezbollah. Some of those capabilities very likely still exist. So I would watch very carefully if Hezbollah decides to go in this direction. Israel has the opportunity to do significant damage, additional damage to Hezbollah. The problem becomes, of course, that the wider you take this war, the more damage you incur as it relates to Lebanon in general. And that's where I think you'll begin to see the international community crying out, trying to prevent the widespread catastrophic damage that would undeniably occur if such a war were to resume there. But I think you have a very careful Hezbollah and probably a careful Iran right now, trying to rebuild what was its most powerful proxy. Right now, it's really not that powerful any longer. As it relates to Yemen, I think it's a fascinating question. And the reason why I think it's fascinating is that the Houthis have become something of a partisan issue here in the United States. If you'll recall, as Donald Trump was leaving office during Trump 1.0, during his first term, he designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization, as an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization at the State Department. Within days of doing so, the Biden administration comes in and they wiped that off the list. They take the Houthis off. Why do they do it? Well, they say it's because they needed to make sure that humanitarian aid could get through to Yemen, which is a nonsensical thing. We have other groups that we've designated as terrorist organizations, including Hamas, by the way, where aid continues to flow to the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that they had been in control, they're nominally in control. We don't have a problem delivering aid to places that are controlled by terror groups. But so what happened as a result of this nonsensical de-designation of the Houthis was that the Houthis became this partisan wedge issue, where Trump saw Biden's policy as wrong, Biden saw Trump's policy as wrong. So now the Houthis are back on the list. Donald Trump has re-added them. But I think that if we start to see them engage in overt hostilities, not just attacking Israel with ballistic missiles, but also harassing ships on the Red Sea, this could be the precipitating factor for greater U.S. involvement. Look, theoretically, there is already an international coalition that is in the Red Sea to protect shipping lanes. In reality, they have done virtually nothing. The U.S. Navy I interviewed on my podcast, Steve, a captain of the USS Eisenhower, who said that his ship sustained more incoming fire and was engaged in more hostilities than any other battle group since World War II. And we have not been on the offensive. We have taken some offensive action against the Houthis, but we have not even begun to scratch the surface in terms of American capabilities. So there is a real possibility of that. But look, the president presides over a Republican Party in particular that is experiencing some schizophrenia, if you will. There is a bifurcation right now of the Republican Party. There are internationalists that have ascended to significant power within the Trump administration. There, I think about people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Elise Stefanik and others. These are people that are very much about using American power, wielding it for good. And then there are others within the president's new government that are what I would call neo-isolationists, people that would be opposed to the deployment of American power, even against a middling terrorist power like the Houthis, because they don't want to see America get involved in foreign entanglements. And so I think the president has some interesting choices and will preside over some fascinating debates inside the Oval if and when it comes to that scenario that you paint with the Houthis, Steve.
Do we have better intelligence today in terms of the potential to strike the Houthis in a way that can cripple them? I mean, it seemed that until this point, whatever's been done has not been able to impact their ability to attack Israel.
It's a great question. I asked the same thing when I was in Israel talking to senior officials there. The answer is yes. The answer is that the intelligence capability has just skyrocketed as far as Israel's concerned. Now, remember, Israel has a ton of Yemeni origin Jews that live in Israel. These are people that are now being enlisted into service because they're able to understand the language, they're able to understand what is being said. So whatever signals intelligence is being picked up, that is now being processed through Yemeni Arabic dialect speakers in Israel. But it's interesting because, several years ago, I remember going to Saudi Arabia and asking the Saudis that I was talking to, saying, hey, what's the odds of the Houthis attacking Israel? And what we heard back then, and it held true for a number of years, was that the Houthis were not interested in attacking Israel. Apparently, the IRGC had kept telling them that they needed to. The Hezbollah advisors that had been deployed to Yemen, they were trying to exhort the Houthis to take shots at Israel. The Houthis refused. After 10/7, the window shifted. The Houthis looked at the blood of Jews that was spilled on Israeli soil, and they began to understand that this was open season against Israelis, open season against Jews in the Middle East. That was how they viewed it. And so it didn't take long before they began to engage in these ballistic missile attacks. And what we're seeing out of Yemen right now, it is remarkable. I don't think in the history of terrorist groups that we've ever seen a terrorist group have ballistic missile capabilities to the extent that the Houthis have right now, or to any extent at all, for that matter, that we've seen, right? You see like Scud missiles and things like that, mid-range stuff that's been in the hands of, the PLO in Lebanon, for example, or some of these Shiite militias in Iraq or Syria. These are long-distance missiles that are going like 1,000, 1,400 kilometers, traveling, across the entire Arabian Peninsula to attack Israel with relative precision. These are the sorts of things that we need to watch very carefully. It's a dangerous dynamic that we cannot normalize. And so there, I think, again, this is where the U.S. may wish to weigh in, but that debate that I mentioned before is a tough one. I don't know which way it's going to shake out. These two key factions within the Trump administration will likely be at odds over operations such as these. But no matter what happens, I can guarantee you this new intelligence that the Israelis are starting to collect on the Houthis, it will play a factor in whatever is struck in future conflicts with the Houthis.
The last question would be the term that the president used, that now the Israeli foreign minister, Israel Katz, has used. and that is that all hell will be paid. I mean, does anyone have any sense of what the translation of that is in terms of strategic, in terms of tactical, what that looks like?
Look, I think nobody really knows, except for maybe the people that are closest to the president, talking to him day in and day out. I think that the president has essentially put on the table that Israel is going to be able to do what it wants to do in the Gaza Strip. It is going to be less inhibited because now you've gotten the vast majority of hostages out. The women, for example, the elderly, the ones that I think Israelis have been most concerned about. Now, I think it's an interesting question. What does Israel do when there are still some men of fighting age that were civilians when they were kidnapped, including also the IDF soldiers that are there? Does Israel go in and start fighting with abandon? In other words, does Israel stop? I mean, if you look at this war, which Israel, I think, has fought valiantly and expertly over the last year and 4 months, the Israelis were fighting with one hand behind their back even as they did that, because they were so fearful. They did not want to attack the tunnels because they knew that there would be some hostages that they could potentially kill. And so if the Israelis go back in right now, and Donald Trump has given them a full green light to do so, and they've gotten the majority of the civilians out, what does that mean for Israel? Are we going to see sort of just a full-throated campaign waged by the Israelis? In other words, no hands tied behind their back any longer. It seems like that's what the president is giving Benjamin Netanyahu a green light to do. What I think is interesting right now, Steve, and this directly relates to your mission. The IDF itself may have reservations about such things, whereas the political echelon may have no concerns whatsoever. And there is this sort of question of, like, be careful what you wish for. Almost a little bit of the dog that finally catches the mailman. When you finally have that opportunity right in front of you, do you take it, or do you continue to fight that war that is precision oriented and just go back to controlling the Netzarim corridor, go back to controlling the border areas around Gaza, control the Rafah crossing, and continue to slowly degrade Hamas? Or do you ramp up the war and try to bring it to a swift end? This is the crossroads that I think Israel will find itself right now, and it's no longer being checked by the Biden administration, right? The Biden administration was telling Israel it couldn't do a number of things. Now they're at this crossroads where they can really turn up the heat on Hamas or continue the war largely as they were fighting it before. I think this is the crossroads that the IDF may find itself on Saturday, and I don't think the answer is as simple as you might think.
It has ramifications in terms of who will control the food, who will control the medical. In other words, it means not allowing Hamas to continue to steal and use for the purposes of power and manipulation the food that's coming in, the medicine that's coming in. It's going to force basically someone else to control it and the population to be serviced in a very different way.
That's one aspect of this. But there's also this, Steve, and this gets back to the question of Saudi normalization and the peace agreements that Israel has with Jordan and Egypt and the UAE, how Israel conducts itself on the battlefield. And we've seen this all the way through. How it conducts itself on the battlefield does play out in the regional diplomacy. And so if Israel wants to sustain some of these relationships or develop some, it needs to be careful what the message is that it projects with regard to its military operations in Gaza, or in Lebanon for that matter. What's so interesting is that you see all these Arab states, they value Israel's strength on the battlefield. They want Israel to win against Iranian proxies. But what they don't want is they don't want to see scenes of devastation. They don't want to see bloodletting at a large scale. So what they're kind of asking Israel to do is to walk this tightrope, to win decisively, but to not see disaster spread in the Gaza Strip. It's already been brutal. It's been a brutal war. Wars are, of course, brutal. But Israel has walked that tightrope up until now. This is, I think, one of the reasons why the IDF may not want to go in a full-throated campaign that just flattens the Gaza Strip. But I cannot right now predict which way we go. But having a green light doesn't mean that you always take it. Being given an opportunity to do something doesn't mean that it's wise. This is, I think, as I understand it right now, part of the debate that's happening within the Israeli security system.
Challenging times. Although as challenging as they are, Israel's in a very different place than it was on October 7th. And it's probably in a very different place than it was for the last 20 years. I think the average person on earth did not appreciate how precarious Israel was with the ring of fire of the 9 proxies enveloping it, the Iranian proxies, be they the Shia proxies or Hamas, the Sunni proxies. Today, though, Israel is as challenging as it is in a very different place than it's been the last 20, 25 years. So if you have these incredibly difficult challenges, you'd rather have them from a position of strength than the position we were in on October 7th.
I think that's right. And Steve, I'll just say this. Speaking to senior Israeli officials on my last visit from just a few weeks ago, I heard a very different perspective than I did the previous trips that I had taken, where the Israelis were really shaken after 10/7. They were shaken after the ballistic missile volleys that Iran had fired into their airspace. I think the Israelis right now see an opportunity to remake the map of the Middle East in a way that would ensure the security of the Jewish state for decades to come. This is similar in nature to the 1967 war, right? This idea that, wow, look at this power that we have. How do we wield it in such a way that gives us security long term? This is part of the discussion that we're hearing right now. And again, that's what makes this crossroads so fascinating. They have options right now. They have the ability to do a lot of damage to their enemies. The question is, at what cost and at what point do you pivot toward diplomacy? I don't know when those moments occur. I don't know where those opportunities are, but we are now starting down a path with Donald Trump in power, who's pushing for diplomatic outcomes, but wielding the threat of strength and power, both ours and the Israelis. And this is the way negotiations should be conducted. And we'll see where it leads us.
Jonathan, on behalf of all of us at Friends of the IDF, thank you for your analysis. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for providing us a context, because you can't have an analysis if you don't have a context. And you always do that. We're very grateful to you and to the good work that you and your team does at FDD.
Thank you, Steve. I very much appreciate all that you do and always enjoy speaking with you.
A great week.